lecturer in international relations at the Institute. Oh, so much better. Okay, do you want me to start again? No, right? Anyway, I was just introducing myself, so who cares? Dr. Karen Smith is the Special Advisor on the Responsibility to Protect to the United Nations Secretary General. She's also lecturer in international relations at the Institute for History at Leiden University, and her current research focuses on non-Western contributions to international relations. And then we have Dr. Cristina Stefan, who is the co-director of the European Center for the Responsibility to Protect in the UK. She's also an associate professor of international relations at the University of Leeds in the United Kingdom. And her research focuses on gender and the responsibility to protect. And then finally we have Dr. Eamon Aloyo, who's assistant professor at Leiden University's Institute for Security and Global Affairs, and he works on a range of issues that are all at the intersection of international relations and political philosophies. And one of these issues, obviously, is R2P. So you have their full bio for all of them. You have their full bio on the website for the event and also in the invitation that you received. But I think it's going to be much more interesting for you to listen to what they have to say rather than to hear me give you more details on their bios. So we're going to start with presentations from each of the presenters for about 10 minutes, answering questions that the panel organizers have designed before the panel. So I'm going to, you'll have the questions again on the invitation, but I'm just going to read them to you to make sure that all of you got them. So the first question that our panelists are going to address is how can we move beyond discussions of gendering R2P in a way that is not a one-way street? By which we mean, can we move beyond discussions of whether or not elements of R2P are not gendered? And how can we think about how to mainstream the three pillars across the UN activities, especially in the areas of development and atrocity prevention? Then we have a second question for all of the panelists. How can the principle of R2P be fortified strongly enough and embedded in the international community more effectively to help prevent genocide and other mass atrocities? And again, the idea is to ask how we can move the debate about R2P away from sticking points about sovereignty and beyond the accusation that R2P serves as a Trojan horse for the West. The third question is about institutional preparedness. We're approaching the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. People at the UN are already thinking ahead at the 100th anniversary of the United Nations in 2045. And with that in mind, the organizers wanted us all to think about how the kind of institutional changes that are required in order to implement R2P norms more effectively. So what kind of changes do we need at the United Nations? And what kind of changes do we also need in regional organizations? And the last question is how can political challenges be overcome among the P5? And also, crucially, how can we integrate perspectives from the global south? So each of the panelists will take 10 minutes to give us their ideas on each of these questions and also to talk more broadly about their broader work and their broader research as it relates to R2P. And we're going to start with Dr. Smith.
Thank you very much, and I just want to thank again the organizers for having this event and allowing us to share some thoughts on R2P with you this evening. I also just want to start off perhaps by saying that don't expect us to have all the answers to these questions. I think what will be really interesting is to hear from the audience as well what your thoughts are on some of these things. So, I mean, for just personally myself, working currently as special advisor on R2P, I'd be very interested in getting views on things like, how do we break the deadlock amongst the P5 in the Security Council? I'm not sure if anybody in the room can answer that question, but if you can, please put your hand up. I'd be keen to hear from you. I also just want to say that I have a cold, so I apologize at the outset if I have to stop at some point, drink water, or grab a throat lozenge. So I'm not going to answer each of those questions in turn. I thought I'd just say a few things in general that I hope will address most of the questions. But I think we should start at the outset by really just reminding ourselves what we are talking about when we talk about the responsibility to protect. Because I think we easily move into the realm of the abstract, and we think about the political debates going on at the UN, and we think about some of the academic debates about the responsibility to protect as a norm being contested, etc. So I just want to reinforce at the outset that the responsibility to protect really is a political commitment that was made by states largely in response to what happened in Rwanda in the 1990s, right? So it was important, and I think that's important for us to underline, and it's important for us to keep reminding states of this because they tend to forget about this as well, right? That it was a call by Kofi Annan at the time to say, what do we do? What do we do in the face of a situation like Rwanda as an international community? And so that's really where it kind of came from. And that's really important because I think if we look around ourselves, if we look at what's happening in the world today, certainly the responsibility to protect and the urgency of atrocity prevention is more relevant than ever. It's not something which is part of history. The second point I wanted to make, which I think is related to this, is that there continue to be pervasive misconceptions about what the responsibility to protect is all about. And I'd say the first one that I keep coming across, whether it's speaking to diplomats, whether it's speaking to civil society, academics even, who I would assume know better, but there's still, many people still have this assumption that really R2P is really the same as humanitarian intervention, right? And so I think, again, the onus lies on all of us who work on R2P to say, well, actually, no, R2P was exactly a response to this idea of especially unilateral humanitarian intervention, right? This idea that states could just decide on their own accord that they would intervene in the affairs of another state based on what they regarded as relevant, appropriate humanitarian concerns. So I think that's really important, and so we need to get away from, some people still talk about the language of the right to protect, right? It's not that, and that's why there was a whole debate about the language, which is the responsibility to protect, and the fact that it changed the whole idea of sovereignty quite substantially to one of sovereignty essentially as a right to sovereignty as a responsibility. And so I want to underline that because I think that's another big misconception, that R2P undermines sovereignty. And this you hear from states often. And maybe I should also make this point that a lot of states use these arguments obviously out of a position of strategic interest, right? They don't actually believe many of these misconceptions, but they use it for political reasons. So the one I often hear as well is, responsibility to protect undermines sovereignty. Well, in fact, it doesn't. It actually strengthens sovereignty because the first pillar of R2P is all about the fact that the primary responsibility lies with individual member states to protect their populations. And this is another important point, right? The wording that is used in the Outcome Summit document of 2005, populations. It doesn't say citizens, which means that it includes refugees, for example. It includes migrants who do not have citizenship in states, but they also, the state also has the responsibility to protect them. So it's really only, as you know, the language tells us this, when states categorically fail to protect their own populations, that responsibility then falls to the international community. But importantly, that responsibility doesn't directly translate into military intervention, right? This again is this kind of idea that some people think, okay, so that then becomes the role of the international community. The state is not protecting its population, and therefore there needs to be military intervention. So again, this is somehow a kind of misconception that R2P undermines international law. In fact, it's entirely in line with international law. So again, the responsibility to protect does not allow for states to take any action that is in contravention with existing international law, including the UN Charter. So when we say that the international community has a responsibility to respond, it means that they're allowed to use any of the mechanisms available in the UN Charter, so both the peaceful means available under Chapter 6, but also the more coercive means under Chapter 7. But as those of you who know the Charter will know that that's not just military action, right? It involves things like sanctions and other coercive means as well. And we shouldn't forget that peacekeeping is a really important element of this as well. And I think we've seen real progress in the last few years around the inclusion of a protection of civilian mandate now in the majority of UN peace operations, which was not the case even 10 years ago. So I think we've seen the international community taking up that responsibility in that way as well. The other thing I wanted to quickly touch on is this idea that R2P is a Western concept. Now, as a South African, this really annoys me, because I think it really takes away the agency and the important role that especially African states played in the development of this idea, but also in the implementation and the operationalization of the responsibility to protect in practice. So I'm not going to go into history of R2P, but I just wanted to mention that there were some really important African individuals, including Francis Deng at the UN, who came up with the notion of sovereignty as responsibility. In the transition from the Organization of African Unity to the African Union, we saw a shift from the idea of non-intervention to non-indifference. And if you look at the AU Charter, Article 4H, we actually see R2P language in the Charter even before the World Outcome Summit document of 2005. So African states really have been at the forefront of developing this idea that states have a responsibility to protect their own populations, and that particularly their neighbors then, right, their regional counterparts have a responsibility to act when states are failing to do that. So I just wanted to mention that. Maybe we could talk more about that as well. So in terms of the questions relating to, so what do we do with the fact that maybe R2P is kind of stuck at the moment? I kind of think of it as a brand that's somehow been damaged. And I think the Libyan situation was one of the big things that damaged the brand of R2P. So, sorry, I'm just going to take a sip of water quickly. So I think for those of us who believe in the principle, who believe that it is, and I should hope that all of us believe it's important to protect people from the gravest of human rights violations, and I want to just mention those atrocities again: genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing. For all of us who believe that these are important things to protect people from, I think it's up to us to also raise awareness and inform other people, to educate. Many of us here are educators, to educate about what responsibility to protect really is about. And I think one of the ways to do that, to kind of counter these misconceptions or these criticisms of R2P, is to really look at examples of R2P in practice, and to not always just use the Libya example, right? So to say, well, actually, there's lots more beyond Libya. And so we can talk about some of these in the discussion as well, if you like. But for example, the Gambia is a case which I think not enough people know about, right? The fact that the Gambia is actually 2017 is a really good example of how the sub-regional organization ECOWAS, but also actually supported by the African Union and the international community, actually managed to intervene initially through mediation and later actually through armed force as well to actually prevent atrocities from happening in the Gambia. But these are the stories we don't hear, right? And we know this from watching the news. Prevention doesn't make the news headlines. And so we always only hear about the cases where prevention has failed, perhaps, right? So I think it's really important for us as researchers as well to seek out those examples of where responsibility to protect has actually worked in practice. And states and regional organizations are doing this on a daily basis. They are implementing national atrocity prevention frameworks. Regional organizations are doing a lot of work in terms of building atrocity prevention lenses into their conflict resolution. So, for example, my office is working very closely with the African Union at the moment to build this into the continental early warning system. So the international community and member states on the ground are very much, aware of this. They're very supportive of it. Oh, my time is over. Sorry. Okay, I will finish my sentence. So there's really a lot that's happening, I think, positively. And I think these are the stories that we really need to hear to kind of counter this this kind of negative, constant referral to Libya as having, signaled the death of R2P. So in short, we can talk about Libya more as well, but I think Libya for me was more the problem of Security Council accountability rather than a problem of the principle of the responsibility to protect. So maybe, can I just mention what I would have spoken about? So in case any of you are interested, you can ask me this in the Q&A. So I think there's some practical steps that we can take to prevent atrocity crimes from happening. And there's some very specific things that can be done both at the level of the UN, but also at the level of regional organizations, in terms of also connecting R2P to other agendas, which I think perhaps Cristina will talk about the Women, Peace and Security agenda, and also institutionally within the UN. There's much more that the General Assembly can do, there's much more that the Human Rights Council can do. It's not just a Security Council issue, right? I think that's the other big thing. It's a human rights issue too. It's not just about peace and security. So thank you very much for allowing me to go over time.
Thank you so much. And now I'm going to give the floor to Dr. Aloyo.
Thanks so much. Let me also thank the organizers, Dr. O'Malley and Dr. Newby, wherever you are. Thanks for having me here today, and as well for organizing the conference and how much work these things are. So it's really a privilege to be here, as well as sharing the stage with such distinguished scholars and practitioners. So thanks to each of you. What I'm going to try to address today is the questions about institutional preparedness, as well as how to more effectively think about preventing genocide and other mass atrocity crimes. This is something my research touches on and something I've been thinking about for the last few years. So mostly what I'm going to focus on today is Pillars 2 and 3. For those who don't know, Pillars 2 and 3 basically focus on assisting states when states are unable to protect their own populations. As Dr. Smith mentioned, these are not only citizens, right? I think that's a very important point that she made. And then Pillar 3 is the more coercive aspect of R2P, including but not limited to armed intervention. So the first point I want to make is thinking about how better organizations, regional organizations as well as states themselves, may be able to institutionalize R2P. So something I've worked a little bit on is the Atrocities Prevention Board in the U.S., which was founded under the Obama administration. This is an example of a very imperfect way forward. Basically, the idea was there would be an interagency meeting. So that means that basically representatives from State Department, Justice, the intelligence agencies, and others came together to try to think about a whole government approach to how to address atrocity prevention and raise that up through the bureaucracy. So this is one example. Other states have taken other ways forward on this. I wonder if, though, something like this could be a model that other states could adopt. Of course, it's imperfect. There are recommendations and ways to improve that. And I wonder if there's also maybe something for civil society or even academics to think about whether there could be some benchmarks for different states or different organizations to have it. One thing that came to mind, this is a new idea, I haven't tried it out that much before, but we know that something like 0.7% of GDP for foreign aid is a benchmark, right? Many states don't meet that. But could there be similar benchmarks for what states should be doing for atrocity prevention? The next few points are about thinking how better to get data and how to use data to respond to atrocities. So obviously one thing really important is to think about how do we know whether atrocities are going to occur or not? What are the risk factors? Right? There's a huge amount of work done on this. I think some of it could be better done. And one thing that I'll mention, I wrote about this in a 2018 article on Global Responsibility to Protect, is trying to think about at a more granular level. Okay, let's say there's following 5 or 6 or 10 or 15 risk factors. What else do we know about those risk factors, right? Do some increase a risk by 5%, whereas others increase it by 50%, right? This seems like a very important thing to know if you're a policymaker trying to think about how to respond to a mass atrocity situation. So can we get it at a more granular level for these types of risk factors? Just one example that I wrote about in this paper that I mentioned is about nonviolent resistance versus violent resistance to a government. Right? This is drawing on Erica Chenoweth data, and she basically found that violent resistance against a government is about 3 times as likely. So in 68% of cases, in some data that she published, shows that violent resistance provoked atrocities against those agitating for government change versus 23% for nonviolent resistance. Right? So about a threefold difference. That seems to me quite important when we're thinking about what sort of policies should be implemented to try to mitigate the risk of atrocities. This could also be helpful to speak to, if we're thinking about upstream prevention, what sort of things should be prioritized, right? If you're thinking about how to link foreign aid, for instance, and atrocity prevention, if you look at and you have different, say, percentages or even rough ballparks, right, about how risky certain things are, then you could potentially help prioritize certain funds going to the more risky aspects that could cause atrocities. The second thing is sort of the flip side of that, right? So what do we know about the effectiveness of different policy responses? There's a huge range of policy responses, right? Again, to emphasize the point the special representative made, it's not just about military responses. So there's sanctions, right? There's negotiations. There's a whole toolbox, fairly well known about what sort of things could be done in the pillars 2 and 3. I think we can probably get better as a atrocity prevention community thinking, again, about the granularity of these. So I'll just give some examples. Sanctions are very popular, right? They're not violent, so it's somewhat more politically feasible to do this. But some of the data that other researchers have done, and here I'm thinking especially about Matthew Crane, so he's published work to show that if sanctions are implemented when there are ongoing atrocities, on average they have no impact on the severity of atrocities. Right? So if you're a policymaker thinking about, okay, what's in my toolbox to, say, mitigate atrocities next year, right? It doesn't mean that we should never implement sanctions. That's not the point that I'm trying to make, nor that Crane emphasizes, right? But he's saying if you do implement sanctions, you shouldn't think that most of the time they should have some great effect on the severity of ongoing atrocities. So I think we need to get better at trying to think about, okay, we have the tools in the toolbox, but what sort of individually and in combination, what sort of tools are most likely to achieve the policy outcomes that we want to achieve? The fourth point relates to these two earlier ones, and that's not to think about R2P as sort of siloed or unto itself, right? So to continue on with the sanctions example, there's a large literature showing that sanctions often have very negative impacts, right? So if you're thinking about women's rights, human rights more generally, sanctions also have negative impacts much of the time. So again, I'm not trying to come up with some sort of policy recommendation. What I'm trying to suggest is we think through the various ways that the political science and international relations literature may help inform policy making and how to make these tough trade-offs. Because as the professor said yesterday, not all good things always go together, unfortunately, right? So you might have to make these hard choices, especially in R2P situations. And the last point, this is something I'm just starting to think about. There's not much in the literature that I've been able to find about it, and that's trying to think about evidence-based decision-making in small groups and how so I've looked at some work on forecasting from Philip Tetlock and others, trying to think about how some of these other very interesting empirical research may be useful for R2P and atrocity prevention. So whether that means the groups working on R2P should be reformed, whether it means different steps should be taken in those, right? Often intelligence leads. So if you're thinking about this country situation, right? Often from the research I did on the APB, it seems like a desk officer briefs the latest updates. Perhaps we should be thinking more about the probabilities of certain situations, and then of course draw on the best intelligence there. There's much more to say. I'm happy to discuss this further, but I'll leave it there for now. So thanks again.
So I too want to start with the thanks to Alana and Vanessa. It's been truly a privilege and a pleasure to be here for the 2-day fabulous workshop on, where are the women after Resolution 1325, but also to be here tonight in such super distinguished company and talk about the responsibility to protect. Now I realize, in hindsight, in the last month ago, I got really carried away with the questions, so I diligently had pages on each of the 4 questions, which I was trying, panicking, like what am I going to say first? So we'll see how it goes, what I can cover in actually 40 minutes worth of notes. But I'll start in the order of Alana's questions. How do we move beyond discussions of gendering R2P in a way that's not a one-way one-way street, and we managed to mainstream this across the UN Secretariat. And this question, I think, starts with the one problem we identified in regards to R2P in the workshop. It's the criticism of R2P being gender blind, and that's quite a serious criticism. And also, in terms of what Karen mentioned earlier, the failure of R2P to engage with other related UN agendas, such as the Women, Peace and Security, or other agendas that emphasize the role of the central role of gender in violence and conflict. And there are examples of attempts of the previous efforts from the UN Joint Office, the UN Office on Genocide Prevention and R2P, trying to tackle this. And I found one in the 2013 report of the UN Secretary General, trying to link Women, Peace and Security and R2P agendas by recognizing the gender discrimination and equality as significant for R2P, because they are increasing the underlying risks associated with sexual and gender-based violence, which can, of course, constitute genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing. And gender discrimination is closely linked to the conditions for the atrocity crime. So mainstreaming a gender perspective requires investigation into the logics and the practices of gender and its effects on people who are affected or operating within the framework of the responsibility to protect. So, I mean, we could discuss potential avenues to fix this major problem, perhaps a resolution, a new Security Council resolution, explicitly connecting R2P and Women, Peace and Security is the way forward, to connect a structural focus on basically preventing gender discrimination that leads to violence, and to provide an enforcement mechanism for the Women, Peace and Security during situations of atrocities by linking it to the R2P. But it's ultimately about tackling the duality of prevention to include addressing the root causes of the structural aspect and responding to early violence, the operational aspect as well. And at the end of the day, I think it's not about reinventing the wheel, but about using what's already out there in terms of indicators, risk factors, which is something the UN Office on Genocide Prevention and R2P published already. But the idea would be to get these various offices and agencies across the UN work together on and recognize the shared interests in prevention and early warning. UN Action, the Interagency Standing Committee on Women, Peace and Security, and the very UN Joint Office. Right, now, how can the principle of R2P be fortified? How can we move the debate about R2P away from the sticking points about sovereignty and accusations like the Trojan horse for the West? And I'll start with a question on agency. When we think about R2P, we tend to think that this is this UN thing, because it emerged in 2005, the World Summit Outcome document, but it shouldn't be a UN thing. R2P implementation should focus at micro level efforts to embed atrocity, crime prevention, and response into the work of a variety of actors in international society, and especially regional, local actors who are in a position to prevent and respond to atrocity crimes. On R2P's complexity, it is a huge agenda, and it's a very complex framework for action. This is why it's so contested, actually. It applies to such a variety of stakeholders. It's really very broad. It's 4 times 3, the 4 crimes of the 3 pillars covering multi-actor responsibilities, a complex set of prescriptions for each of the separate actors. So it's quite massive. And if we look at how it was articulated in the first report of the Secretary General on R2P, the first of 10 now, annual report, 11, right, 2019, yes. So yeah, in the 2009 one, it is described along the three-pillar formulation, and it is including all these different descriptions for different actors, including sovereign states, regional and international organizations, civil society, private sector. But it is, I want to emphasize your point about sovereignty, because you do hear it a lot, and it's such a annoying misunderstanding. I mean, R2P is a welcome clarification of standards and responsibilities for protection that values both vulnerable populations and state sovereignty. I mean, you're at the Trojan horse. It's a Western concept again that comes up again and again, especially as academics and researchers. You're co-directing the European Center for R2P. Isn't that really such a Western concept? You do that in Europe. You have countries like Canada. So basically, the R2P emerged as the title of this report, issued by an independent commission, but the commission, with the name of the Independent Commission on Intervention in State Sovereignty. I won't use the acronym anymore for obvious reasons, but that was funded by the Canadian government, and because of that, that's when the accusation started. It was an independent commission, and just to add to Francis Deng's amazing work, of course, starting with IDPs and sovereignty as responsibility. I mean, if we look at the two co-chairs of the commission, Gareth Evans, surely, but Mohamed Sanoun, an amazing African diplomat, like his work was just fabulous. He wasn't as vocal as Gareth Evans, so people tend to forget about, sorry?
I said 3 people longer.
Yeah. So, right, but I mean, people tend to forget about him, and it's actually, it's because I when I was doing my PhD research in Canada on this, it's these little anecdotes which are just so, heartwarming and inspiring. I mean, so Mohamed Sanoun turns out was best friends with Salim Ahmed Salim, who was key in the former Organization of African Unity before the African Union, and he opened Sanoun's eyes, like, do you know about this, article for Age, and just this is how, one of the anecdotes of how the responsibility to protect. Basically, the report came out in 2001, I'm sure you will know, but this happened way before. So the role of the African groups, the responsibility to protect, this is one aspect that's usually ignored. So I wasn't planning to even talk about it, but I got carried away, because I think it's an important message to, still we need to clarify it after all these years. On Libya, of course, Libya didn't help at all, and 1 minute. Yeah, I mean, right, so I didn't get to the Libya. I mean, we can talk about Libya and how it affected everything that came after and why it's actually so, or not. Because, I mean, R2P is not just about UN Security Council. It can happen, and it can certainly be implemented, and we can hear success stories which are not, we don't really advertise them as much as we should. You mentioned Gambia. I mean, I can think of Guinea. It didn't even make it to the Security Council agenda, and it didn't have to, because it's a successful example of prevention, because sub-regional actors, like you mentioned, ECOWAS, African Union, have been key in this sense. And I think there's an important message which was really highlighted. It was just so inspiring in Severin's keynote speech last night. But also in one, I think, mistake that we've all been doing, we tend to focus on the negative, right? We see what's not working, but I think let's look at the successful example, and let's highlight those, and let's look at lessons learned. Why did it work there, and try to replicate that somewhere else. And I think this is one thing that I was going to suggest for the question on institutional changes at the UN if it comes to the office. Like the former special advisor on the responsibility to protect, Ivan Simonovic, had this idea of a new project prevention assessment project, basically a compendium of practice. Let's look at some case studies. Let's look at what worked precisely to highlight the success stories. And I think we need to do more on that. And on the broader challenge of implementation, it's precisely focusing on preventing atrocities rather than responding to atrocities. And just to bring Libya, because it brings up Libya again, engaging in mass atrocity prevention does not mean preparing for another Libya, but rather avoiding, another Libya through earlier action. Time over. Yes. Thank you.
Opportunities to speak about all of that, especially because I think that we should take a few minutes now to have each of our panelists respond to what they've heard from the others. And I'd like to take the question that you asked about how to, let's say, how to fix R2P's gender problem. I think that would be a really interesting question to discuss, especially given the workshop that we've had over the past 2 days. And I think that Dr. Smith and Dr. Aloyo, that would be really interesting to get your thoughts on that. And also, Dr. Smith mentioned at the beginning of her presentation, or at the end of her presentation, that if anybody had any idea on how to overcome the political challenges among the P5, and that's one of the points that you didn't get to speak about, because I cut you short. So perhaps that would be also an opportunity for you to elaborate on that. But we're going to have the same order of the speakers, so we're going to start with Dr. Smith.
Thank you very much. So I completely agree that this is a really important issue, and I think the criticism is a fair one, that R2P has, to some extent, been a little bit gender blind. I think if you look at the, so Cristina was referring earlier to a framework of analysis that the Office of the Special Advisor on Prevention of Genocide and R2P developed in 2014, and which is available on the website, which is an interesting tool, I think also for students doing research. It essentially allows you to assess risk factors, right? So you can look at any country situation and you can actually assess the risk factors that are present that may lead to the commission of atrocity crimes. And so in there's really just a very small mention of the gender dimension, and that is that when we see high levels of discrimination against women and violence against women, that is one of the indicative risk factors that may lead to the commission of atrocity crimes. But I think it's important for us to think about the role of women across the spectrum of R2P. So if we think about, from the level of prevention, and so again, I wanted to talk a little bit about prevention, because that's something which we keep hearing. But Eamon also mentioned the fact that we have to unpack this thing about what prevention works where. And that's actually a project linked to what you were talking about earlier, this kind of best practices, looking at where prevention has worked. Something that the office is doing right now, actually, in collaboration with the European Union, is looking at country situations and trying to apply those best practices that we know, these types of preventive efforts have worked somewhere. How do they play out in other areas? Because I think that's the kind of research that we still need to do, that very kind of specific research. And I think there, as women, as actors of prevention, have been very much underplayed in that. So we see women playing really, really important roles at the very, very early stages of prevention, but also if we think about prevention in a broader sense, in terms of structural prevention, right? The building of resilient, tolerant societies. So again, focusing on the positive rather than the negative. So not just the risks, but rather what makes societies more resilient. Where do we see a lower risk of atrocities happening? And that's in societies that are resilient, that are tolerant. And these are also societies where women play an important role and where women's rights are respected and where there's lower levels of violence against women. Then, of course, there's the role of women as victims, and I think that's the one that we tend to hear of most, right? So women as victims of atrocity crimes, whether it's rape as a weapon of war, or whether it's genocide, people tend to focus on the role of women as having to be protected. But again, I think there we see very, very positive stories about women playing a very active role, particularly in things like civilian self-protection. So there are stories of women living in villages in Mali who are the ones who go and warn the villagers in the next village to say, the rebels are coming, there's nothing we can do about it, but at least we can come and warn you and you can protect yourself. So women play a very active role in that regard as well. But then, of course, also when it comes to, especially in conflict situations, the role of women as mediators and peace builders in the post-conflict environment as well. So I think across the board, we need to really focus more on the role that women play as preventers, peace builders, protectors as well. But yeah, lots more to say about that. Maybe Eamon has more to.
Sure. The first thing to say is I'm one of the people who has not done as much work about gender and R2P. So I'm also part of the problem, and I want to admit that first. So I don't have a lot to say about this. I haven't published on this in the past. One thing that I will say is that I think it's important to try to think about how to get more women in positions of authority and in the room of decision making. Right? You can think of fantastic people doing great work on R2P, including here on the stage. Samantha Power is sort of a role model of mine as well, from the U.S., from Ireland. The second thing to say is that I think we need to, when we're thinking about mass atrocities, think beyond just mass killings, right? If you look at the underlying crimes against humanity, I think there's 11 underlying acts that can constitute a crime against humanity. So it's not just about mass killings, right? So mass atrocities don't equal mass killings. So of course we have to think about sexual and gender-based crimes, but also all sorts of other things that constitute crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide, right? Genocide, again, is not just about killings, right? There's other things. If you look at the Rome Statute, besides just killings, that can constitute genocide. So I think that's important to think about when we're thinking about what constitutes a mass atrocity. It may be these other things as well, and those have gender dimension. But I know Cristina Stefan, whose great paper I read, has much more to say about this, so I'll pass it over to her.
I could talk about that, or I could talk about, I was assigned a question on P5.
Or you can talk about both.
Or I can talk about both. I thought about, just clearing the air about Security Council and P5, because it's a question that always comes up when we talk about the responsibility to protect. So I'll start with that, and then basically I touch on several pages of points for the question before I leave that to. But I think, so personally I believe there's a lot we can do in terms of implementing the responsibility to protect framework outside the Security Council. So when it comes to Security Council authorization for the use of course that is the most extreme, the one tool in the massively broad R2P toolbox. But when it comes to that, and it came to that in 2011 with Libya, I think there's an important point to be made about agency. That again, we tend to forget when we focus on what was wrong with Libya. And a lot of things went wrong because basically NATO didn't stop until we got regime change, which was not part of Security Council resolutions the P5 agreed on. So no doubt Russia and China believed they were tricked, and that explains why then later on we've seen inaction and serious double vetoes from Russia and China in regards to Syria. I mean, Kofi Annan, we forgot to mention Kofi Annan as one of the key supporters of the responsibility to protect agenda when he was UN Secretary General. So there was nobody more supportive than him, and even he said basically Libya almost destroyed R2P because ever since 2011, what NATO did, it gave R2P a bad name. It became really, really toxic. But if we look at what actually happened, and I'm trying to bring in the Global South question, and all the BRICS were in the Security Council, elected members included, in 2011. So Brazil was actually presiding when this happened, so it gave quite a role and a voice for some key countries from the Global South to do something. But what happened was the usual suspects, China and Russia, were saying, well, actually, it's regional actors asking us to do something in regards to Libya. So in that particular case, regional agency was key to change the minds of the critical P5 in regards to the responsibility to protect. The only other time when it happened in regards to the referral to the ICC R4 was several years before, right? But with Libya, it was anonymously packed. But the message I'm trying to do with the regional actors is actually regional actors can act as gatekeepers for the kind of issues that make it to the Security Council agenda in the first place. Of course, it's R2P it's quite context specific, and nobody in the region really liked Gaddafi. It's a completely different story if we look at Syria with Assad and his very powerful friends. But bottom line is regional actors played a key role in ensuring and asking the Security Council to authorize the use of force in Libya. To go back to the point on Brazil, actually, this is a case study I looked closely at, and Brazil is a norm shaper. They, of course, produce their own version of the responsibility to protect, so responsibility while protecting. I think it's another important message in terms of what can be achieved when some of these powers have actually take a seat at the table. So it just happened that they were one of the elected members, they were presiding, they had a platform, they were able to lobby for their ideas to be heard, and based on Brazilian preferences. So if we look at, for those of you in the room who look at norm contestation, subsidiarity, localization, so these are specific examples of the theory at work in the case of Brazil. But then I was thinking about more the agenda of the workshop on women, peace and security in South Africa. Very, very active recently as president of the Security Council in regards to the Security Council open debate on women, peace and security. Again, if we look at Global South initiatives, I mean, I have to go back to South Africa and Rwanda. It's key in terms of lobbying and pushing for the responsibility to protect agenda prior to the World Summit Outcome document in 2005. So there's a lot that could be done outside the P5 kind of argument and just criticizing like the P5, they're going to veto, or that's why we see inaction. And just as examples, I think again I'm going back to the positives. Maybe these days I'm just trying to be focus on the positive examples. But I think we do need to highlight examples from the Global South. And great things happen. I mean, last week at the Peace Palace here in the Hague, right? The International Court of Justice began its hearing in the Gambia's case against Myanmar for the crimes committed against the Rohingyas. And right, of course, the Gambia's request was on behalf of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. So, good example. Let's champion this. We want more of this.
Thank you so much. And now we have plenty of time, I think, for questions. So I'm going to take a round of 3 questions, then let the panelists respond to the questions that they want, and then we're going to go on until 6:30. So why don't you start?
Yes. Me? Yes. Okay. I was wondering how has and should the response mechanism of R2P and the prevention mechanism been used in Yemen?
In 1985, Netherlands Human Rights Commission said that Tamils cannot be allowed to struggle on their own, we must do something. And in 1981, International Commission of Jurists said the international community must help the Tamils. So there must have been something happening for them to say this. We got independence, Sri Lanka got independence in 1948. Within months, the Tamils, a part of the Tamils were disenfranchised, while a major part of the world has been working towards franchise. They were disenfranchised. So I am not going to say a lot more, but right now, in the last 10 years, since the end of war, the war-ravaged area, Tamil area, has been hyper-militarized. 90% of the military has been shifted there, and there has been what you call, oh my God, this
why
is...
don't you tell what the question is?
So,
for
yeah,
finalists?
so what is this, if this is, psychological operations are going on for 10 years on the Tamils, for 70 years they have suffered, now it has disintegrated a lot. When will the UN talk about R2P for the Tamils?
Yemen, Sri Lanka, and?
I am curious about the sort of binary that was presented as like there's peaceful intervention and that's sanctioned, and there's military intervention. But I'm curious about the people, the populations on the receiving end of that intervention, because I think it's quite clear that militarized violence is not the only violence, and economic violence would impact the most vulnerable people in the country. And I'm sort of wondering if there's some space for nuance on this issue of like when a sanction is not necessarily a peaceful intervention. If that that's it.
I can start, yeah. Thank you. So on the Yemen question, actually, this is obviously one of the failures, and I mean, I can only talk about, you know, at the end of the day, we have to accept that the responsibility to protect is not a perfect framework at all, and there's inconsistency that's going to come up again and again, sadly, and we do hear these questions a lot, you know, if Libya, why not Syria? If Kenya, why not Sri Lanka? And unfortunately, there's obviously a lot of frustration, anger, criticism, you know, if it's not working, then why do we need it? Look at where we are now with Yemen, and we all knew about it. Some of the P5 are funding, you know, obviously doing the wrong things, but I mean, I want to just broaden it up a little bit with what the response. I'm going to try to keep it short, but I mean, it's the issue of inconsistency is, at the end of the day, heartbreaking. But with the responsibility to protect, there's no one size fits all. Some crises are very complex. For others, there's a lot of P5 interests involved. And one thing I want to point out, basically, the way in which the UN embraced the responsibility to protect framework in the 2005 World Summit document institutionalized inconsistency. That's what it is. You know, paragraph 139 talks about ultimately we're prepared to take collective action through the United Nations Security Council on a case-by-case basis. So that was the U.S., Bolton's initiative. That's, in track changes. I have that for my PhD dissertation. Signed. This is the way to for the U.S. This was the way for the U.S. to basically let it pass. But we have on a case-by-case basis in the World Summit outcome documents. For me, that is institutionalizing consistency, and we are going to see that. Unfortunately, implementation of the responsibility to protect depends on a host of factors. It can be normative factors, the right authority, just cause, and all that, but it also non-normative geopolitical considerations. So we have to accept that selectivity is inevitable. On the point about what's going on with the Tamil Tigers 1985, so just to clarify, I mean, I know that was quite broad. Obviously, 1985, there were other frameworks out there of protection. R2P was not even a baby or in its infancy yet. But the issue of Sri Lanka, in regards to R2P, came up big time in 2009. And it was a huge debate, at that point amongst the R2P supporters, actually. Is it an R2P case or not? Bottom line is it came to the Security Council again. The Security Council was saying this is not an issue that should be on our agenda. This is an issue that should be, on the Human Rights Council agenda. But as a result of the failure in 2009, I mean, the UN came up with the human rights up front. I mean, they recognized a major problem, and that was during Ban Ki-moon's years as Secretary General. So yes, human rights up front was a result of Sri Lanka 2009 failure. On the difference with, I mean, humanitarian intervention, military intervention, impact of sanctions, I mean, there are so many tools. It depends on what pillar we're talking about. So yeah, the effects of sanctions on overall population can be terrible indeed. But there's one aspect, one type of sanctions, targeted sanctions. Sometimes they actually work for the craziest reasons. Again, I'm going to mention this. It's quite it is a silly example, but it worked in Guinea. So pretty much the interim president got his name on the EU sanctions list. So he was very keen to have his name removed because himself and his wife couldn't go shopping in Paris anymore. So a lot of things, changed because of some really specifically targeted sanctions.
Thanks. I think Christina's already answered a lot of these questions, so maybe I just wanted to say something a little bit more general. I think when we ask questions about country-specific situations, whether it's Yemen or Sri Lanka, I think we also have to make the distinction between, often people ask, what is the UN doing, or when will the UN do something? And I think we have to distinguish between the different agencies of the UN. I mean, UNDP is always very active in all these different countries. And as I said, a lot of that is, engaged in structural prevention, which is a part of R2P. At the same time, you could say, well, what is my office doing? So that's the office that deals very specifically with these issues. And, we are very much engaged with things like promoting intercommunal dialogue in Sri Lanka together with the resident coordinator in the country. So it's really about, unpacking which part of the UN you're speaking about. Of course, the issue about member states is a very particular one, and Security Council authorized, action. And as Cristina was saying earlier, of course, right, we don't live in a perfect world, right? We live in a world of realpolitik. So we know that when any of the P5 or their allies are involved, that's going to create a deadlock, right? So that's the very, very simple answer to perhaps why we've not seen some of the action that. Sorry, do you want to?
Yeah. What should the Security Council do?
Well, maybe I'll leave that question to you. That's always a very difficult one, right? So yeah, I mean, sanctions against whom, right? And who's going to approve them? So I think we always have to think about what is in the realm of the possible as well. I think that's, I'm also an idealist, and I would love to see a world where there's no more war, no more intolerance, no more discrimination. We know that that's not the way the world works. So as Cristina said, we're working with a kind of imperfect mechanism. But I think the one thing I want to underline is that I don't think we should throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? Which a lot of people tend to do. They'll say, R2P is not doing anything in Yemen, it's not doing anything in Syria. Yeah. Well, again, coming back to, should we then just give up on it? Should we just say, well, let's just forget about the fact that all member states of the UN actually made a political commitment in 2005. to protect populations. And maybe, sorry, I'm going to move this in a slightly different direction, but I think something which is really important and which also addresses this notion of R2P as a Western idea is that we often tend to think about it in foreign policy terms, right? So states think about it in this way as well. They think about how can we engage in preventing atrocities in other places, and this reinforces this idea that there are kind of R2P situations, mostly in the global south, and that somehow it's the responsibility of the global north to protect these people. And in fact, I mean, that's one of the big things that my office has been trying to emphasize is that, firstly, the first pillar is that every single state has the responsibility to make sure that it prevents any possible risk of atrocities against its own population. And that means also addressing the risk factors, one of which is hate speech. And we know that hate speech is very prevalent today in the European Union, in the United States. And so it's emphasizing that R2P starts at home, really. This must be first and foremost a domestic issue. And secondly, it becomes then an issue that we think, oh, how does this apply to how we relate, in our foreign policy to other countries? So I just wanted to make that point. But also coming back to your question about, the whole principle of do no harm. What kind of harm do sanctions do? So it's sometimes a catch-22, and that this is an interesting debate about, what is the aim of, for example, using military intervention to prevent atrocities from occurring. If your aim is to prevent atrocities from occurring, I think you have to measure the success or the failure of an intervention based on that. What happens next, I think, is of course really important, right? So the kind of peace-building part of R2P, which actually fell by the wayside in the 2005 outcome document. It was very much part of the 2001 report, right? Where the third pillar was still peace-building. But for various political reasons, that was not part of what was agreed in 2005. But I think, that's something that we need to consider. But a lot of people will argue, and maybe Eamon has a position on this as well, from a kind of moral or ethical, philosophical position, that if your aim is primarily to prevent people from being slaughtered, yes, it might have the effect eventually of, having negative effects in other ways, but that's perhaps not as important. And I'm saying that that's one of the debates, right? We can engage in a debate about this. One of the questions is, well, do you take the risk? You say, well, do we just leave it because we're not quite sure what the impact of this is going to be in the long run? So 10 years down the line, maybe the situation in, and I say Libya cautiously, but might be the kind of situation that we don't want. But at this point in time, our decision is, do we prevent potentially thousands of people being killed, or do we not do that because we're not sure what the outcome might be? So it's a very, very tricky, complex situation. But thanks for the question.
Thanks for the questions. I'll focus on the first and the third just because I know less about Sri Lanka than the other two. So the Yemen question is the first one. One thing to say that Dr. Stefan mentioned already is that my country, the United States, and other countries are implicated, I think, in Yemen by selling arms to Saudi Arabia, right? When we know Saudi Arabia has very likely the least committed war crimes. So I think part of R2P is thinking about things not to do as well as things to do, right? So if sort of, as the U.S. is, if sort of selling weapons is par for the course, I think part of R2P should be not selling weapons, at least some of the time, to those countries involved in mass atrocities, right? You could, of course, say that other countries would just sell them weapons in this case, but at least then your country is not the one implicated in that. Of course, I think there should be further steps taken, and part of my response will be thinking more about the process, about coming to those decisions rather than telling you what the decision should be. So one thing I think is obvious, right? We should be helping people not starve to death. I think that's obviously part of R2P, especially when food is weaponized and can be potentially a war crime. So that's part of it. But I think part of thinking through what sort of response should happen should be thinking about what are the things most likely to be effective in this case, right? So you should draw on the literature from political science, from international relations, trying to think about what is likely to work the best. And this sort of relates to the third question, which I'll turn to now. most likely not to have the worst side effects. So yeah, I thought some about this question. I've written some about this. So I think it's useful to maintain a distinction between violence and non-violence, if for no other reason than many people have these sort of common sense notions, right? If you punch someone, it's a violent act. Right? If you, say, take away someone's food, yes, it can be wrong, and it can even be worse than some violent acts, but I think it's worth maintaining these distinctions. So the second point to make is that I think sometimes when we think about R2P and differentiate these things, part of it is for political reasons, right? Often the violent actions are much more politically sensitive than the non-violent ones. I don't think that necessarily maps onto what's morally important and what's morally unimportant. So part of what they wrote about in the 2001 ICISS report are these just war theory precepts. So I think we should be thinking about proportionality, for instance, necessity, when we're doing non-violent actions, sort of in the traditional use of the term, right? So sanctions, for instance, is first and foremost among them. So, right, are sanctions going to be proportionate to the harm that we're likely to be prevented? So yeah, I've tried to write about this in the same piece, this 2018 Global Responsibility to Protect piece. I tried to say that we should be thinking and taking a just war theory lens to R2P, including the non-violent actions, right? So it provides some policy guidance, and I think there's a good basis for that from this 2001 report. So yes, I think sometimes non-violent acts can be worse than some violent acts, and vice versa. But I think within R2P we should be thinking about the moral implications of all different types of actions within the R2P toolbox.
Thank you so much. We have time for another round of questions. So I'm going to try to find a man to ask a question, given that they are in the minority today. Yes, one at the back.
I heard a definition at the beginning of the discussion, which was the R2P is somehow a Western Trojan horse. And I would like to elaborate a little bit on this and hear the opinion of you. Why do we have this definition, and how it was possible that we came to this definition? Thank you.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, so Eamon just touched on it there really, but I'd love to know all of your opinions on this kind of, to go a bit more into this idea of applying the moral argument to it, and how you in your research, but also when it's relevant to policy making more specifically, how the moral argument comes into it, because at the end of the day, everyone who's done political theory has to kind of come down on either like utilitarianism or something, you have to kind of decide like how, what you were saying as well in terms of does one act kind of outweigh the other, or is one act inherently bad no matter how big or small it is? How does that moral dilemma come into actual policy making when there's people in the room who are on completely opposite sides?
Yes. Hello, thank you for the discussion. My question is concerning the concerns. So today, in the country of Georgia, on the so-called de facto borders to Abkhazia and South Ossetia, there is a Russian military standing. And we know that Russia has been using so-called passportization in order to obtain this responsibility to protect. And now it's, instead of saying that Russia is intervening in the sovereignty of Georgia by having military on the land, it's using responsibility to protect, and that is thanks to passportization. And I would like to hear your opinions about this. Thank you.
Yeah. So on the responsibility to protect Trojan horse, of course, there are a lot of critics of the responsibility to protect agenda, and you'll hear Noam Chomsky, for instance, would say it's all about the West trying to use this new platform to basically intervene militarily wherever they want to reach their goals. So that's the whole point. But I hope we try to explain clearly why that's not the case, and that's not what R2P is. On the moral argument point, I know it's immanential, but it's at the end of the day, it's this fundamentally this challenge to prioritize to prioritize politically the needs of the distant others, right? And that's a political mandate that's really really difficult to push forward or to sell if we talk policy terms, you know, because it's a bit selfless, right? So that is the challenge. I think it sums up fundamentally the challenge of the moral argument. On Georgia, it's actually wrote an article with Tomois and the Russian claims of basically invoking the responsibility to protect of the Russia-Georgia war in the summer of 2008 over South Ossetia. I remember one morning, it's just Lavrov on BBC Hard Talk defending, you know, why the Russians, they really strongly believe in this responsibility to protect their own people in Georgia. So the theoretical argument, if you're interested, I can send it to you. It's basically the responsibility to protect can be abused. Obviously for the wrong reasons at times, but I think it's a good example. I mean, we didn't get to talk about it, but the Chinese and Russia's criticism, and they are completely against the responsibility to protect, but on the other hand, if you look at the kind of justifications they've used in the past and how they really misabused this framework to their own advantage, it's obviously very problematic, but at the end of the day, everybody recognizes their exaggerations and their lies, and I think at some point it actually validates the responsibility to protect framework, because I mean they are trying to use something that makes sense to the rest of the world. So to me, it was quite a validation.
Thank you. So I mean, just briefly to your question about R2P as a kind of Western Trojan horse, I think the big criticism is the issue of selectivity. But as we just heard, I mean, the Russian example shows us that everybody's selective, right? So it's always a political game. So I think that reinforces this idea that, you know, even Russia, who's one of the big detractors of R2P at the UN, likes to use it when it thinks that it's in its interest. I mean, my other kind of counter-argument to this idea that, you know, the West is just waiting to go and invade other countries is, in fact, we've seen the exact opposite, you know, over the last few years, that there's been a huge inaction by states to actually go and assist those who are, you know, suffering from mass atrocities. We've heard some of the examples here: Yemen, Syria, etc. Right? So in fact, we don't see that states are kind of just waiting for any opportunity to go and use military force. There's a huge lack of political will at the moment to take any kind of action. So for me, that kind of completely undermines that argument that everybody just wants to use military force. The question about the moral dilemma, I think again, Eamon will be able to give you a much more kind of reflective answer to this. I mean, my response to this is that my fear is that we're losing a kind of moral compass in global governance in general. I think that to me is the big concern, that we see leaders who don't seem to be governed necessarily by, you know, what they themselves are convinced of is morally right. And I think that is one of the big things now where we're seeing the space for that kind of, you know, opening up, because we see these supposed role models, you know, leaders of states that previously, whether right or wrong, whether you agreed with them or not, seem to have, you know, be basing their actions on some form of kind of morality, at least the one kind of whatever they believed in. But that seems to be lacking entirely. And I think maybe I wanted to mention something else here. You know, R2P is very much often talked about in a kind of state-centric discourse. And I think Cristina made the point earlier that we really need to change that as well, right? So of course the primary responsibility lies with states, but, you know, much more so, there's so many other actors who can play a really important role in terms of specifically prevention. And here I think individuals also should be held accountable much more. I've just used the word accountability. This is something that we haven't even spoken about, right? The importance of accountability. You mentioned the Myanmar case, but, you know, also the role that the General Assembly has been playing, the Human Rights Council, in terms of trying to establish mechanisms to hold perpetrators of atrocity crimes accountable when the Security Council fails to act. But yeah, so my big concern is I think we need to reinforce this notion that individuals, whether they are, heads of states, ambassadors who are, P5 ambassadors sitting on the Security Council, that they should be held morally accountable for the decisions that they take. And I think that's largely missing. Yeah, I already mentioned Georgia, so I think that's just a clear case of how this is used selectively by all states.
Thanks. Let me touch on this question about the moral aspects of R2P a little bit. So part of the work that I did was on this atrocity prevention board, and one of the people who worked in the U.S. government told me that he wished that a key phrase about moral responsibility was left out of I think it was PSD 10, which is what set up the atrocity prevention board. So I think even if, and I think more or less everyone involved in R2P is motivated at least in part by moral reasons, I think it's also incumbent upon us to think about what sort of reasons should be put forward at different times. So even if you're there for moral reasons, perhaps you should not use that sort of language. So this person said that should have been left out, right? It should have just been framed in terms of national interest. Why? Because that's what carries the weight in, say, the National Security Council, right, in sort of formulating U.S. foreign policy. So I think, yeah, we should be obviously thinking about morality. We should be thinking about the impact of sanctions, violent, non-violent. But of course, we should also be strategic when we're trying to make arguments and see what will stick at different levels of government. I haven't been in government myself, so this is secondhand information. But maybe the only other thing that I'll say about the Trojan horse discussion is that I think some of the things that have happened, so if we're talking about Libya, for example, Alex Bellamy says this in his 2015 book, that it may have been in sort of traditional national security interests of the U.S. to not have intervened, right? The U.S. has done this throughout its history, prop up governments, autocratic governments that have committed human rights abuses. Why? Because it's in their national interest. So I don't think, R2P sort of necessarily changes that much for what governments have done in the past in terms of propping up governments that have protected their interests as they perceive them, right? So it may actually encourage some sort of things that would not be in their sort of traditional national security interests, trying to protect human rights and prevent atrocities.
Thank you so much. We have time for a third round of questions. If you can keep your question short and to the point, and our panelists will also keep their answers short and to the point. And yes?
When does the solution to the block that the P5 is causing to action and effective action become removing their veto power?
Yes, sir.
The AU's intervention in Sudan during the crisis leading up to Bashir being moved on as president, it was probably a situation where there was big potential for violence and atrocities. And the AU was involved and not much is known, at least I didn't see very much written about what has been done behind the scenes. But isn't that an example of the African use of R2P exactly to prevent atrocities against civilians?
I want to ask a question about gender and how that is used. So often when we talk about gender, peace, and security, we talk about that we should go beyond talking about women as just victims, but also as peace builders. Isn't that too simplistic as well? Like, if we talk about gender mainstream, should we also, isn't that also that we agree that men and women basically occupy the same roles, but maybe in different extents? Like, yeah, just maybe elaborate on that as well.
Thank you. So, on the Security Council, we come back to the Security Council. So the short answer, I personally think, again, we have to accept that it's a waste of time to try to talk about Security Council reform. The P5 will have their veto. The P5 won't like countries like South Africa and Brazil join in, because that's basically diminishing their powers. It's never going to happen. This is the way the UN was set up way back in 1945 is of course very wrong because this is the 21st century and it's not reflective of the global powers and global governance of the 21st century. But I personally don't see how we can tackle that. So this is why I said, rather than looking towards the future, how can we really make implementation work better in regards to the responsibility to protect? I think the future promises are at the micro level as opposed to macro level normative questions related to sovereignty or Security Council membership. This is the way it's going to go, but there is so much potential outside the use of force, which comes with the Security Council. A lot of potential, to implement R2P outside that very one extreme end of the R2P spectrum of actions available. Now, definitely, this is the point with, we don't hear enough about what other actors are doing, and the African Union, especially like on the African continent, regional actors have been really, really active. And it goes to the point of what we were saying at the very beginning. We tend to say, well, what is the UN doing in this particular instance? We tend to expect the UN to act everywhere else, but there are so much resources and interests related to regional actors actually making a difference on the ground. So definitely, on the question of women as victims versus women of peacemakers or peace builders, I think this is something we covered in our Alana and Vanessa's, like the panels were just fabulous, trying to go beyond, the role of women as mediators, women as peacemakers. There's so much value and agency. This is what we covered the 2 full days, so yeah.
So I just wanted to add to the question about the Security Council. So I think, we're all rather pessimistic about the possibility of, getting rid of the veto altogether. But you're probably familiar with the French-Mexican initiative, which is about basically asking the P5 not to exercise their veto right in the case of mass atrocities. And so of course we will need all 5 of the permanent members to actually then, agree to that. But what is interesting is that there's been quite a lot of progress within the General Assembly. So there's now over 100 members of the United Nations who actually support that initiative. So I think pressure is building, right? And these P5 members are going to be, have to explain why they're not willing to do this. Because I think, and perhaps there again, the kind of moral argument, becomes that why, when we see mass atrocities happening, for example, as we saw in Rwanda, how can you say that you will not give up your exercise of the veto in those kinds of cases? So I think there are some interesting developments happening there. So I think watch that space without becoming too optimistic, perhaps. Absolutely, Andre. I think as Cristina emphasized, there's so many excellent examples on the African continent of R2P in action. And what really frustrates me is I think that Africa is not taking enough credit for this. And so, we hear this kind of, there's a few African states who are opposed to R2P, but for the most, they're kind of lukewarm supporters, I would say, with some more vocal supporters. And I really think, it kind of takes away of all this kind of good work that we've seen by African regional organizations and sub-regional organizations. And so I think, that's part of the message that I want to kind of promote as well, is that really African states should take credit and should say to the rest of the world, like, this is how we've been doing it, this is part of this kind of broader agenda, right, that the global north is becoming more like the global south, and the global south already knows the answers to most of these issues. So I think it's really an opportunity for states from the global south to be more active and to be more empowered, I think, in the UN and in global governance with regards to issues such as these, because we've done it. The examples are there. I think you've already answered the question about gender mainstreaming. Absolutely, of course, right? We have to think about it in a much more kind of complex and a sophisticated way. having said that, now with one foot in the UN, I also see the value of simplifying things, right, for practitioners. So sometimes, we can have a certain type of debate when we're amongst academic peers, but sometimes you have to translate that in a way that really just makes sense to practitioners. We don't have that much time. And so sometimes I think some things come across as being a little bit too simplistic, but yeah, that's how things are. So.
Thanks for the questions. The veto for the P5, I think it's worth sort of re-emphasizing, although this wasn't your exact question, that I think the vast majority of R2P happens outside of the Security Council. So it's not to say that it's not important, right? I do think Security Council reform is important, but much, and say the vast majority of R2P happens outside of the Security Council. So Dr. Smith already mentioned the French-Mexico veto code of conduct, and I think part of why this is put forward is not because they're sort of naive thinking Russia and China, among others, would sort of always go for this, but rather to put pressure on them, right? So it would increase the cost of veto. Again, whether that's actually the case or not, or whatever they actually care about it, remains to be seen. I think it's worth remembering, too, I'm pessimistic about short-term Security Council reform. I think it was reformed once in 1965. That's off the top of my head, so I may have the date wrong, but I think it was expanded then. So I think activists should continue pushing for it and thinking about trying to make these global governance institutions into fairer places, both for R2P-related and other issues. Let me turn to the second question briefly. I think this is an interesting example, right? Some about the nonviolence. And again, if in trying to think some about how we can use data to inform not only states, but also individuals, say, trying to think about how to get rid of a terrible dictator who has very likely committed genocide and crimes against humanity and war crimes, right? So I think looking at the work of Erica Chenoweth, among others, looking to see what works best in trying to not only get rid of a dictator, a nonviolent action she finds is more effective than violent one, but then also this thing that I mentioned in my opening remarks about the probabilities for atrocities. Right? These people were extremely brave going out into the streets, going up against Bashir. Right? We know what he's capable of, and yet they prevailed in the end. Right? Not that they always would, but the data suggests that it was a better choice than trying to overthrow him by violent means if you're looking to try to prevent atrocity. So I think it's a great example of not always relying on the international community to try to do some work with local, literally people in Khartoum went out in the streets and did many other things, right, to have a change of government there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we're 1 minute away from 6:30, so just the time to thank you, all of you. Thank you so much for coming tonight. Thank you for your short questions. Please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists for answering all of these questions and for giving us all of their thoughts on these various issues. And I wanted to thank the organizers, but the organizers have something to say.
Sorry, I'm just going to echo the thanks, especially to these group of panelists who've been with us for 2 days and have given extra time right before Christmas to come and discuss with us. So really, I want to thank you all so much, and especially Severine, because she stayed an extra day in The Hague just so that she could come and share her insights and moderate this panel for us. So please, yes, thank them.